10 years ago, she left home with nothing but a code-filled notebook and a letter from the only person who believed in her. At her sister's wedding, they didn't even recognize her until the MC read her name as the event's guest of honor. What happened in between? Let me tell you a story about erasure resilience and the quietest revenge that shook a whole room into silence. The last conversation Eliza Monroe had with her father wasn't a conversation at all. It was a verdict. "If you're so smart," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter, like a man too busy for disappointment, "then you'll figure out how to pay for Stanford on your own. We've done enough." Eliza didn't cry. Not then. She just nodded, because anything else would have made it worse. Her mother, standing by the fridge, didn't speak. Her silence had always been sharper than her words. It wasn't about money. Not really. The checkbook had never been the problem. What her parents couldn't give her was belief. Faith. Space to be someone who didn't shine the way her younger sister Heather did. Heather was made for the spotlight. Eliza had always been the shadow they forgot to turn the light toward. 3 hours later, Eliza sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by 2 suitcases and a box of notebooks. She folded the corners of old computer science textbooks. Her fingers smelled like dust and old dreams. Her walls were still covered in equations she'd scribbled in erasable marker formulas her mother had called boyish nonsense. Now they looked like tombstones. Her phone vibrated. A message from UPS, delivery confirmed. She went to the front porch and saw it, an envelope with her name written in deep purple ink. No return address, but she knew. Only one person still sent letters like it was 1962. Grandma Eleanor. The handwriting was steady, dignified, just like her. Inside was a single folded note and a cashier's check. "You were never the ugly duckling. You were the swan born too early. Use this to begin. Let no one tell you you are less. Love always. Grandma E." Eliza's knees buckled a little. The amount wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to breathe. Enough to say yes to Stanford's partial scholarship. Enough to leave. She didn't pack a photo of the family. She didn't even take the sweater Heather once gave her as a backup option. What she took was her old laptop, a jar of trail mix, and the letter folded once, then again, tucked behind her passport like a sacred document. At 6:43 a.m., she opened the front door quietly. The house smelled like old toast and lemon cleaner. She stood there for a moment, her suitcase by her side, waiting for something. A creak on the stairs. A whispered, "Wait." But the house stayed still like it always had when it came to her. Her father was already out playing golf. Her mother, she imagined, was finishing her morning prayers, Eliza's name never included. She closed the door gently behind her. And just like that, she became a girl without a house key. Outside, the world didn't shift to mark her departure. The sun kept its ordinary rise. The neighbor's dog barked at nothing. A crow flapped across the driveway like it had better places to be. But to Eliza, everything felt heavier. Final. At the bus stop, she turned around one last time. The house stood exactly as it always had, well-kept, impersonal, cold. There had never been room in there for someone like her. She wasn't soft enough, pretty enough, compliant enough. They hadn't hit her. No. They had done something worse. They made her feel like her presence was an inconvenience, and yet she hadn't left angry. Not fully. Somewhere deep inside, where little girls still build sandcastles for approval, she thought, if I become someone important, they'll see me. They'll wish they'd looked closer. But another voice, steadier now, rose up to meet it. "I don't need to be loved. I need to be real, seen, named." She exhaled. As the bus rolled into view, she grabbed her bags. She didn't cry. She didn't wave. She just stepped forward. Because sometimes healing doesn't come with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins in silence at a bus stop with a letter in your pocket and no one to say goodbye. And still you go. The apartment was advertised as cozy, which in Seattle meant damp, overpriced, and shaped like a hallway. It had no real windows, just a square of cloudy glass above the sink that looked out onto a brick wall. The air smelled faintly of ramen desperation and lavender dryer sheets that couldn't quite mask the mildew. Eliza Monroe shared it with two other girls she met during orientation: Yasmin, who worked nights at a Thai place, and Rory, who danced back up in a bar that pretended to be a theater. They took turns on the single bed, sleeping in shifts, and rotated ownership of the only folding chair. There were no rules, just an unspoken agreement. Survival comes first, pride comes later. Eliza worked mornings at a bakery, evenings at the university library, and overnights transcribing medical notes. Her nails were always chipped from flour or ink. She kept her laptop wrapped in a scarf she never wore, more precious than jewelry, more fragile than memory. She didn't party. She didn't flirt. She didn't join clubs or sip overpriced coffee. Every night while the city buzzed outside and her roommates whispered about boys and broken shoes, Eliza sat in the corner of the room, earbuds in hoodie pulled low, learning to code from decade-old YouTube videos and free Python courses. Sometimes when the power flickered, she would light a single candle and keep going anyway. No one ever asked why she worked so hard. Maybe they thought she was ambitious, or intense, or a little cold. But the truth was simpler. She didn't have a safety net. She had no fallback plan, no home for the holidays. If she slipped, she wouldn't fall into a mattress. She'd fall through everything. Her GPA held steady, though not without cost. There were days she forgot to eat, weeks when her roommates would quietly leave half a sandwich on the counter, pretending it was their leftover. Eliza never said thank you out loud, but she always noticed. Gratitude for her lived in action. In the middle of her second year, a professor named Dr. Klein noticed her. He was old school, rough around the edges, and didn't usually engage much outside lecture. But one day after class he said, "You're not the loudest student, but your logic tree in that AI module tight. Who taught you that?" Eliza blinked. "No one. I just figured it out." He nodded slowly. "You thought about applying for the innovation incubator?" She had no idea what that was. "It's a research grant," he explained. "They give it to students with working prototypes. Your classroom project adapted could be real." That night, Eliza didn't sleep. Instead, she wrote out the blueprint for a platform that used AI to tutor high school girls in underserved communities, those like her who had drive but no access. The platform wouldn't just teach, it would adapt, speak in their rhythm, learn from how they learned. It would be quiet, steady, patient, just like the way she had taught herself. For 2 months, she worked after work sketching code by hand. When her laptop died, running simulations during borrowed lab hours, building the skeleton of something real. She didn't tell anyone. Not Rory, not Yasmin, not even Dr. Klein. Because if it failed, she wanted to fail alone. But it didn't. The day the email came, she was on her lunch break behind the bakery, chewing on a stale piece of bread she'd pocketed earlier. Her phone buzzed. She saw the subject line and nearly dropped it. "Congratulations. You've been selected for the Innovation Incubator Fellowship. We believe your work has the power to shift educational access for underrepresented communities. A stipend of $4,500 per quarter will begin this fall." She sat down on the pavement surrounded by old milk crates and flour sacks and cried quietly into her sleeve. Not because of the money, but because for the first time, someone official, someone who didn't share her blood, looked at what she built and didn't call it foolish or ugly or too much. They called it promising. She got home late that night. Rory was asleep and Yasmin was watching videos on her cracked phone. Eliza opened her laptop. A single new file. She named it Project Eleanor. Because the woman who first told her she could do great things would have smiled wide at this moment, not for the award, but for the way Eliza had claimed her space in the world. No applause, no spotlight, just one line of code after another. And that was enough. The first investor smiled like he was trying to be kind, but his words were a gentle blade. "It's an inspiring idea, Eliza, but it's a bit early stage. And you don't have a CTO or a technical co-founder. Maybe if you partnered with someone a little more seasoned?" She nodded, thanked him for his time, and left with a tight jaw and a bruised dignity. Investor 2 didn't smile at all. Investor 3 didn't even read the full deck. Investor 4 patted her on the shoulder like she was a Girl Scout selling cookies in a venture capital building. 4 meetings, 4 rejections, each time the same undertone: too young, too female, too alone. But Eliza kept showing up. She returned to the borrowed lab late at night, fed on black coffee and fury. She watched her code compile in slow, flickering progress, bars reminding herself that building anything real often looked like failure in motion. When she finally found someone to help Jared, a grad student with a knack for back-end development, it felt like relief. He was smart, friendly, full of startup lingo. They talked for hours over whiteboards and burritos. He loved the mission of Project Eleanor. He said it had traction potential. Eliza thought maybe this could work. Until it didn't. 2 months in, she logged into the prototype and found major changes made without her knowledge. The branding had shifted, the messaging was different, and in Jared's GitHub history, she saw he had cloned her repository. He had stolen the core of her code. By the time she confronted him, he was already pitching Tutor IQ to a new incubator in Portland, with her algorithm rebranded, her vision reworded. "Look," he said with that voice people use to sound reasonable. "It's just business. You didn't even have a patent. We were both working on it. I just moved faster." Eliza stood, frozen hands clenched in her coat pockets. Her ears buzzed. Her ribs felt too tight. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just walked out. That night she deleted his name from every file, changed all the passwords, and started again from zero. Clean repo, clean resolve. This time she would build it herself, even if it took longer, even if it broke her fingers. Because sometimes you don't do the thing to win, you do it to stay whole. 2 weeks later, she presented the revised prototype to a small university showcase, underfunded, underattended, mostly an excuse for engineering students to show off pet projects to their professors. Eliza stood by her foldable table with a printed poster and a laptop barely holding battery. A few students nodded politely. A pair of bored-looking alumni passed by. And then she saw him. Professor Hollingsworth, silver-haired, elegant in an untucked way, tenured before she was born. He'd been a guest lecturer at her high school once. He had spoken about logic trees and data ethics. Her mother had scoffed after the talk. What kind of man wastes his mind teaching teenagers about machines? Eliza had been 16. But she remembered him like a photograph pressed between the pages of her memory. He paused in front of her table. "You," he said, squinting slightly. "Monroe. You were the kid with the recursive algorithm in that after-school contest. You wrote it on paper. I remember the red pen you borrowed." Her breath caught. "You remember that? I remember everyone who builds something before anyone tells them they can." He leaned closer, scanned the lines of code on her screen, read the tagline on her poster, "AI Tutoring, designed by the underserved for the underserved." "Where are you hosting this?" "Still local," she said. "AWS Sandbox. Bootstrap funds only. I lost my collaborator." "You don't need one," he interrupted. "Your logic is clean. The scaffolding is smart. You've got architecture in your bones, not just ideas in your mouth." For a moment she forgot the bitterness of Jared, the dismissive nods of investors, the empty inboxes. "Would you mentor me?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "I already am." Later that night, Eliza walked back to her apartment with aching feet and a USB drive clutched in her coat. The city was dark but alive. Neon signs buzzed in puddles. A jazz saxophone floated from a second-floor window. Inside the apartment, Rory was asleep again, and Yasmin was texting in half-light. Eliza sat down in her corner, opened her laptop, and renamed the folder one more time. Not Project Eleanor, not Tutor IQ, not something designed to impress. She called it persistence. Because the code they said would fail hadn't disappeared. It had just gone quiet, then come back louder. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a tech journal and a bill she didn't want to open. It was ivory thick, sealed with a gold-embossed monogram H+A. Eliza turned it over twice before she sliced it open with a butter knife. Inside was a formal invitation printed in looping script. Together with their families, Heather Monroe and Andrew Keene request the honor of your presence. She didn't finish the sentence. She was too busy staring at the name Heather Monroe. No mention of Eliza, no sister of the bride, no handwritten note, just the polished, mass-produced elegance of someone else's beginning. For a few seconds, her fingers trembled. Heather. The girl who once stood in the doorway of Eliza's dorm room at 17, flanked by their parents, and said through glossed lips, "I don't have a sister." And meant it. A decade had passed since then. Heather was now a pediatric surgeon, according to family friends. Perfect teeth, a glittering resume, and a fiancé from a tech dynasty. Her social media, when Eliza had dared to look, was a showroom of curated Joy Lab coats, wedding rings, and vineyard proposals. Eliza had never commented, never liked a post, never even looked long enough for the algorithm to notice. And yet, here it was, an invitation to her wedding. No note, no apology, no why now, just, "We request your presence." She stared at the RSVP card for a long time. Later that evening, Eliza called no one. She didn't ask for advice, but the questions churned quietly beneath the surface of her breath. Was it a mistake? A peace offering? A formality? Did Heather send it? Or their mother doing damage control? Or worse, did they expect her to say no? She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window. It was raining again, Seattle's favorite habit. Outside, the streetlights blurred against glass, and inside the apartment hummed with silence. The girl who'd left home at 18 would have ripped the card in half. But Eliza wasn't that girl anymore. She had built a company, survived betrayal, lived in cities where no one knew her name. She had coded through tears, bought her own healthcare, laughed with strangers who felt more like family than blood ever had. She didn't need this wedding. But something deeper flickered in her chest. Not revenge. Not vindication. It was presence. The quiet, steady kind that said, "I exist. You can't rewrite me out." She didn't want to ruin Heather's big day. She didn't want to make a scene. She just wanted to walk into a room where she'd once been erased and refused to disappear. The next day, Eliza bought a plane ticket to Chicago. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't post it. She simply marked the date on her calendar with one word: return. When she got back to her desk, she opened her laptop and created a private document. At the top, she typed, "Forgiveness isn't always a gift for the other person. Sometimes it's a key you hand yourself to unlock the places they once barred you from." Then she clicked save and exhaled. The wedding was held at a glass-paneled estate outside of Chicago, polished marble floors, floating candles, and a string quartet playing Vivaldi like it was background noise. The kind of place where everything whispered money and everything shouted perfection. Eliza stepped out of the town car alone in a midnight blue suit that fit like it had been tailored for this exact confrontation. Her hair was swept back, minimal makeup, no jewelry, just one silver pin at her lapel, a small swan. People looked, then looked away. At first, no one recognized her. She walked through the arched entrance as if she had every right to be there, because she did. Servers offered champagne. A distant cousin blinked twice but didn't say her name. The hum of gossip hadn't started yet, but it would. She saw Heather near the front, radiant in her lace gown, surrounded by pastel dresses and perfect smiles. She looked smaller in person, more polished, yes, but somehow thinner under the weight of her own image. When their eyes met, Heather's smile froze. Her lips parted. She said nothing. Their mother was the first to recover. She whispered something sharp into her husband's ear, and he turned eyes wide, mouth tightening like he'd bitten something bitter. Eliza kept walking. Her heels didn't echo on the marble. Her presence did. Andrew, tall, confident, magazine handsome, glanced at her from across the room. His brow furrowed. He leaned into Heather, whispering something. She didn't answer. She just stared as if seeing a ghost no one warned her would show up alive. Eliza didn't flinch. She found her seat table 11 at the very edge of the ballroom. Of course, a name card read Miss E. Monroe, in a font so delicate it barely claimed space, but she did. As the ceremony began, Eliza sat still. She clapped at the right times. She smiled even. But her stillness held gravity. People began to notice. Whispers swirled. A second cousin whispered, "She looks so familiar." Another said, "Is that the sister?" A third, "I thought she wasn't real." And Eliza thought, "They forgot my name. And now they don't dare say it." During the reception, the speeches began. Heather's best friend toasted the most luminous couple, and Andrew's father waxed on about legacy and brilliance and the future. Then came the MC's voice. And now a few words from someone very special. Eliza Monroe. Silence. Not a gasp, not a scream. Just the kind of silence that makes people sit up straighter. Heather's face drained of color. Their mother's fork paused midair. Eliza stood. Not fast, not theatrical, just deliberate. She walked to the microphone, heels silent again, breath steady. She didn't hold paper. She didn't pull out notes. She looked around the room, met eyes that quickly darted away, and said, "I didn't come here to speak. I came because I was invited." Pause. "I didn't come to disrupt your wedding. I came because I still exist." She turned, looking directly at Heather. "You once told the world you didn't have a sister, and I believed you." A murmur. "But I didn't come back to correct you. I didn't come to reclaim a role I was never given space to play. I came to stand here as I am now, not angry, not broken, just whole." She looked out at the crowd again, her voice clear but calm. "Sometimes families leave you out of their story. Sometimes they rewrite you in the past tense. But time has a strange way of preserving what truth can't erase." She stepped back. No applause, no music. Just that silence again, this time sharper, heavier. Then Eliza returned to her seat. Heather didn't move. Andrew blinked, stunned. Their parents stayed still as statues. And Eliza sipped her champagne, slowly tasting at last a kind of peace that didn't need permission. The clinking of forks against plates had just begun again when the MC returned to the stage, voice smooth and rehearsed. "And now we'd like to acknowledge one of today's special guests," he said, glancing down at his cue card. A pause. "A generous supporter of the STEM scholarship at the University of Washington, our distinguished donor, Miss Eliza Monroe." It was just a line, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Forks froze midair. Conversation stalled. Heads turned one by one toward table 11. Her name echoed off the marble. Heather's expression fractured, one part disbelief, one part panic. Their fathers stiffened. Their mother's eyes narrowed as if Eliza had committed some breach of etiquette, as if success spoken aloud was a kind of betrayal. Eliza did not stand. She didn't need to. She simply set down her champagne glass, folded her hands gently in her lap, and met their eyes. "I didn't come to disrupt your wedding," she said, her voice carrying farther than expected in the hush. "I came because I was invited, and because my name is finally on something no one can erase. Nothing more. No speech, no accusation. Just that sentence." That one sentence had the weight of 10 years. The weight of every time she'd been written out, misnamed, dismissed. And now, her name was on a scholarship that would outlive everyone in the room. Not for recognition, not for revenge, but for the girls like her who would never again be told they weren't enough. A silence spread slow and sharp. Then quietly a man at another table raised his glass. Then another. No applause. Just quiet acknowledgement. It was more than enough. Eliza stood and stepped out onto the veranda where the music and murmurs softened. The wind tugged at her blazer. In the distance, lights from the city blinked like old memories. She didn't cry, she didn't shake, she just was, rooted, free. Later, as the evening thinned and the dance floor pulsed with the bodies of the untouched and the unbothered, she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss Monroe." She turned. Andrew. The groom. He looked less perfect up close, like the weight of the day had finally sunk into his posture. I'm sorry, he said, stuffing his hands in his pockets. I didn't know. Eliza raised an eyebrow, quiet. I mean, Heather never told me about any of it. Not really. Just that you left. That you two weren't close. But seeing you today, hearing your name like that, God, I realized I've only heard one side. Eliza nodded, still saying nothing. I just wanted you to know, he added, you didn't disrupt anything. You made everything real. There was something in his voice, something unpolished, genuine. And for the first time all night, Eliza softened. You don't have to apologize, she said. Just remember this, even when someone disappears from the story, it doesn't mean they were never part of it. He blinked, then slowly nodded. Will you be okay? He asked. Eliza gave a faint smile. I already am. The apartment was quiet when Eliza returned. Not the kind of quiet that came from silence, but the kind that arrived after something unspoken had finally been said. Like the air itself was exhaling with her. She kicked off her heels, let the blazer slide from her shoulders, and set the wedding invitation now folded in half on the kitchen counter. It was past midnight. The city hummed in the distance, but here inside these four walls, time felt like it paused just for her. She walked to the old wooden box under her bed, the one she hadn't opened in years. Inside, receipts from her first paycheck, the cracked screen of her college-era phone, a worn notebook with sketches for her earliest prototype, and at the very bottom, creased and yellowing from age, a sealed envelope with her name on it. Eliza, in her grandmother's handwriting, graceful, slanted, certain. She'd kept it all these years, had held it during storms, had carried it across state lines, but never once opened it. She'd been afraid. Not of what it would say, but of what it might awaken. But tonight something had shifted. At the wedding she had stood in her own name. Not as a shadow, not as a secret. She had existed fully, publicly, proudly. She slid her thumb beneath the seal and opened the letter. My dearest Eliza, if you are reading this, I'm no longer by your side, at least not the way I used to be. But if you're reading this, it also means you survived something I always feared you might face alone. There's a fire in you, Eliza. I've seen it. I've felt the warmth of it. But I also know that the world is colder than we want it to be, and not every stage you stand on will be lit. Some will try to dim you, others will ask you to be smaller so they can feel bigger. I want you to remember something. The world won't always clap for you, Eliza, but play your music anyway. Don't live to be cheered. Live so that the person who first saw your light never regrets believing in it. That's what I ask of you. That's all. With all the love I have, Grandma Eleanor. Eliza didn't cry right away. She folded the letter and held it against her chest, as if somehow even now her grandmother's words could make the room warmer. And in a way, they did. Because in that moment, Eliza understood something she'd never quite put into words. She hadn't built her company for applause. She hadn't survived those nights in windowless apartments or investor boardrooms or family erasure to impress strangers. She'd done it for the girl who sat alone in her dorm room at 18, wondering if she'd made a mistake. She'd done it for the woman who told her once upon a time that belief was its own kind of inheritance. The next morning, Eliza drafted a proposal, a scholarship fund, for girls like her, girls who didn't have last names that opened doors, who coded on borrowed laptops, who skipped parties to stay alive, who lived in silence not because they wanted to, but because no one ever asked them to speak. She would call it Eleanor's Echo, because belief echoes, sometimes across decades, sometimes across bloodlines, sometimes across an entire world. And this time, her grandmother's echo wouldn't end with her. It would begin. The auditorium was sunlit and buzzing rows of families clutching flower bouquets, camera phones, and proud hearts. It was the University of Washington's spring commencement, a moment of celebration for others, a full-circle reckoning for Eliza. She sat in the front row on the stage among deans and donors and changemakers. Her name was on the program. Commencement speaker, Eliza Monroe. Founder, Eleanor's Echo. A girl in cap and gown passed by and whispered, "Your blog saved me." Eliza smiled softly. You saved you. She wore a cream dress suit today, not blue. Nothing to hide behind. No armor. She had long since stopped needing it. Rows of students shifted in their chairs. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Her mother, Heather, both seated in the crowd, not close, not apart, like people clinging to old maps in a city that no longer needed them. Her mother sat perfectly still. No wave, no smile, just eyes that blinked too often. Heather looked down as if the sight of Eliza still stung. But Eliza, she smiled. Not out of spite, not even satisfaction, but because she no longer needed anything from them. The Chancellor tapped the mic. And now please welcome our keynote speaker, Miss Eliza Monroe. Polite applause. Eliza stood. She walked to the podium with the kind of calm earned only by those who had once walked alone and made it anyway. She looked out at the sea of graduates' faces flushed with hope nerves and caffeine. Then she said, "When I was 18, I left home with 2 duffel bags, no safety net, and a letter from a woman who told me, 'The world won't always clap for you, but play your music anyway.'" A pause. "I spent years thinking I had no family, no seat at the table. But I was wrong. I wasn't left behind. I was just the first to leave. Sometimes your chair doesn't disappear. It just waits for you to become the person who can sit in it." She looked out across the rows, young women in caps, boys with tearful moms, faculty who had seen it all before. Whatever you build, be it code or courage, know this: no one can take away what you've taught yourself to hold. No one can erase the name you've written in your own hands. She nodded once. Take up space. Especially the space they said wasn't yours. Applause came quietly at first, then it swelled wave after wave of sound. Not because she had asked for it, but because they had seen her. After the ceremony, a few donors approached, hands outstretched. Students took photos. Staff whispered thank you. Eliza moved through it with grace. Then in the courtyard, she saw her mother. Still no words, just that same unreadable expression. Eliza didn't stop, didn't turn. She had already said everything she needed by showing up. As she stepped into the Sun diploma in one handbag in the other, she glanced back only once. The stage was being cleared, chairs folded. But hers, that front row seat with her name printed bold, it had never really been empty. It had just been waiting. And now she'd filled it with more than presence. She'd filled it with purpose. And that would echo long after the applause faded.